Hello everybody and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. We are back in the studio for episode 23 and with lots to get into from all across the racing world, let's get started. Okay, we're going to get started with the MotoGP. It was the MotoGP of Le Mans last weekend, which is always one that stands out on the calendar. To race around the Le Mans track, obviously it's a sort of shortened Grand Prix length track, not the full Le Mans 24-hour track. But it uses the same kind of pits and the same start-finish straight as the Le Mans 24-hour track. And all throughout the categories in MotoGP, it was really, really great racing throughout the series that defined the weekend. And we're going to get started with the Moto3. In the Moto3, there were really 5 people in contention for victory. As it often is in Moto3, it was pack racing until the end. But the start was defined chiefly by kind of intermediate conditions and some questions over the race direction. The conditions at the start of the race were definitely intermediate. It felt like the race was going to get underway, but it also felt a little bit like once a few riders started going down, it became pretty obvious that, the riders weren't going down as a lack of their own skill. They were going down because they were just simply unable to ride the bikes in the conditions that were in front of them. And for that reason, we saw a lot of riders fall off. And after the first phase of the race, after the first few laps, we did get a red flag. And then we ended up with a 14-lap restarted race, a 14-lap sprint for victory after the race got back underway, which was what gave us the incredible pack racing until the end. With Moto3, there's always a lot of very fast overtaking, and because the bikes are so easy to overtake with, and the tracks are, the sort of relative width of the tracks is so high compared to Grand Prix Formula car racing, just simply because the bikes are smaller, and even on Moto3, it's the smallest category of bikes in MotoGP. Because the bikes are so small and so sort of nimble and agile and easy to maneuver, quite lightweight compared to the Moto2 and the MotoGP bikes, there's so much racing room in a Moto3 race. And then what you get with that is so much room for overtakes throughout the entire field. And when people are overtaking, they're going slowly. So the people that aren't overtaking will catch up to them quite quickly. And then, they'll be in the mix for the overtakes and they'll be able to take advantage of the same racing room that the people making overtakes are taking advantage of, which then will slow them down and allow even more people to join the fight, which is really what we saw in that race. Your finishing order was Jauma Masia took the victory from Ayumu Sasaki, Isan Guevara, Dennis Foggia, and Tatsuki Suzuki. Right up until the last corner, it looked like it was destined to be Ayumu Sasaki's race, really, but he left the door open going into the final few corners. He'd worked so hard to pick his way through the pack and leave everyone else racing room to not get knocked off on that final lap when everyone's being so aggressive. Everyone wants to take that victory because DNFs are so common in bike racing in general, but really in Moto3 too, that when you've got the chance of the victory, when you're in that top 5 going into the final lap, you know that you really have to get the maximum points that are available to you. And it looked like Ayumu Sasaki had done that. He had the race controlled going into the final chicane, really, it is at the Le Mans circuit. But he left the door open, and Jauma Masia came straight, flying through, much to the lament of the commentators. They were not happy with Sasaki for the big mistake he'd made at that final corner. But I suppose in Sasaki's mind, it could be potentially that he felt Masia was definitely going to make a dive bomb, and if he didn't leave the door open, they could have made contact and both gone down. We've seen moves like that happen before in Moto3 races quite a lot. But it's unfortunate, really, when we see, someone have to take that much caution in a race where they've been so rewarded for being so aggressive, to end up having to take that much caution into the final sector and ultimately giving away a win at the final corner is really, really tough to see for Sasaki. But, he did come home second and there's still valuable points there. In Moto2, it was a slightly different story. It looked like last year's Moto3 champion, star KTM rider Pedro Acosta, was going to run away with it at the start. He was followed by his teammate Raul Fernandez, but Acosta had the measure of him, and the two KTMs pulling away together at the start was really, really significant for the team. They looked like they were in control of the race. They could manage the tyres the way they wanted, and they had, the pace of the field was going to be determined by how quickly they were going, which is really a great position to be in a bike race, to have the independence or even to have the backing of your teammate in that situation. Of course, the teammates will fight when they get to the end of the race because they both want the victory. But in that first phase, it is really, really important to have someone around you on the track that is, going along with you, wants the best for you to some extent, and is not just going to send a wheel up the inside and potentially knock you off or throw you into a block pass that's going to slow both of you down. Fernandez and Acosta were really able to work together, and it was Acosta that was leading the race. Acosta led the race for the first 9 laps, but then he had an accident. He fell off, the front slid away from him completely on his own. It wasn't caused by Fernandez or any other rider. It was just a small mistake. tiny little mistake, but on these bikes, the small mistakes get punished very, very quickly, and they're very, very hard to save. A little bit unlike a Formula One car, I suppose, when a bike starts going, because it's so physical, because it's so determined by like lean angles, and you're really throwing full commitment into the corner. When something goes wrong, when you're fully leaned into the corner and the front starts sliding away from you, unless you're Marc Marquez and you have this supreme kind of spidey sense talent to catch it at the last possible moment right before it goes off. Maybe Acosta's was still developing, but he didn't quite have that spidey sense to pull the bike back up or do whatever possible save he needed to do to keep the bike together and on track and in the race. Frankly, it might be that it was completely impossible to save, and that as soon as the mistake was made, there was no saving it. Le Mans is one of those tracks where, well, I suppose particularly because it's a bike racing track, once you get gravel offline, once the bike goes beyond the limits of the track and the curbs and the concrete, it's going to be extremely hard to pick the bike up out of that gravel, even to pick yourself up out of that gravel when you've fallen off at high speed. Behind Acosta and Fernandez, there were pretty decent battles for second and third and fourth position. In Moto2, because there is that big step up to the kind of bigger, heavier bikes, but you're still getting a class of relatively young riders, it's somewhat mixed throughout the field. I suppose almost a little bit more mixed than Formula 2 in the difference between the bottom age and the top age of the class, but the conversation is always going to be centered around which riders are getting promoted onto the big bikes, onto the factory MotoGP teams, and often those are going to be the younger riders, because the Motorsport factory teams, they want the younger riders who they can take their development with, who they can potentially buy at a sort of lower price, sign a low price contract early on in the rider's career, and then get their money's worth when that rider eventually develops into a supremely talented rider, like everyone's expecting Pedro Acosta to do. His seat, whether it stays with KTM, whether he gets onto the factory KTM bike alongside Brad Binder, or whether he gets picked up by another team, the demand for Acosta is extremely high at the moment. Young Spanish rider, Moto3 champion, and everyone's really watching to see where he ends up, which factory bike is it going to be. And speaking of factory bikes, the question of Suzuki, what's going to happen now with Suzuki? Now they want to leave the sport, and they're leaving two world-class riders, Joan Mir and Alex Rins, without a bike. Which factory team is going to take, you've got the world champion Joan Mir. It's not like he's going to leave the sport. I'm sure there's quite a few nervous people at the moment in the MotoGP paddock that know that in terms of a sort of relative performance or power ranking type situation, they're below Joan Mir, and as much contract security as any of them have, the teams are always going to look for the best riders to be put on the best bikes. And when Joan Mir's factory ride at Suzuki is, of course, being taken away when Suzuki leave the sport at the end of this year, there are some people that are going to be nervous and people that are might be replaced by him. But the question of where Rins and Mir are going to go is a pretty interesting one. And of course, those conversations at the moment are happening behind very, very closed doors, very, very secret rooms. So I don't really have anything to report on that beyond speculation. But it's going to be really, really cool to see where they end up. So yeah, finishing order for Moto2, Fernandez from Canet, from Sumkiat Chantra, from Cameron Bobier, and from Ayagura. So that was your top five. Really interesting championship this year in Moto2, but not one that is being particularly settled like by on track in really high class racing. It's quite different to Moto3, and it's a bit of a weird intermediary ground between the small bikes that you get in Moto3, where the racing is super, super fast, or, well, actually the racing is not that fast, but it's super, super good in the terms of the quantity of overtakes and the quality of the overtakes as well. You feel like the riders are kind of correctly proportioned to the power of the bikes, both in their physical structure, just the fact that they're, mostly young guys between 16 and 20, really. Of course, like Moto2, there are still some older people. It's not so much of an age limit like we see in Formula 3 and Formula 2. But in Moto3, it is quite like, that they are suited to the sort of physicality of their bikes. But in Moto2, it can feel almost like sometimes they're not quite strong enough, both as riders and physically strong enough to handle the power and the handling of the Moto2 bikes. And whether that's a problem that should be fixed on the technical side to improve the bikes, to make them more manageable, or whether that should be fixed, just on the riders getting better. It's an interesting balancing act there. But we're going to move on to MotoGP now, because the MotoGP race at Le Mans was absolutely brilliant. It was really, really cool to watch that. Over 100,000 fans attended the race on Sunday, which was truly, truly epic. Really, really popular, of course, with last year's world champion Fabio Quartararo, Motorsport in France, and particularly MotoGP in France, is really on an uptrend. While we've seen Formula One grow rapidly around the world, it's still really, really cool to see Motorsport and MotoGP grow in France, primarily because of the following of Fabio Quartararo being that figurehead for the sport. I'm sure is really, really important to him to demonstrate what a beautiful sport it is, what a fascinating sport it is, and how these guys really are pushing the limits of both physicality and technology on the bikes. And the speed of the MotoGP bikes is absolutely incredible. It's not quite like Formula One, where, you know, you're seeing potentially not quite the fastest ever Formula One cars at the moment. Like, I think everyone's really looking at the 2020 Mercedes probably will go down in history as the fastest ever Formula One car. But the MotoGP bikes are genuinely just getting faster every season. And there's some questions around the aerodynamics of that at the moment, and whether the added aerodynamics that are coming in and making the bikes faster at the moment are somehow incorporating the problem of dirty air that Formula One has been so actively trying to work against. Of course, the MotoGP bikes are much, much smaller, but then because they're so small, it takes less dirty air to throw them off, right? So even though they're just adding small elements of aero, the freedom to work aerodynamically on the bikes is being opened up a little bit, and the teams are using more aerodynamics as they're looking to improve their bikes and to find more speed. The theory is then that is decreasing the overtaking because of the increased aerodynamics, which I'm not sure. I'm not sure how measurable that is, or how tangible that is, where you can actually say for certain that is something that's affecting the bikes, or that is something that's affecting the quality of the racing. Because at Le Mans, I think we really got brilliant racing. The battle for the lead was fought mostly between Jack Miller, Pecco Bagnaia and Enea Bastianini. In the first few laps of the race, it looked like the two factory Ducatis were pulling away, but Bastianini eventually was able to close that gap and ended up going on to win the race. So Bastianini kind of slowly picked his way through. Your finishing order for the race was Bastianini from Miller, from Espargaro, from Quartararo, from Johann Zarco. If you're wondering where Pecco Bagnaia is in that finishing order, it's because while Bastianini was kind of cutting his way through, Jack Miller fell back slightly. It became a fight between Bastianini and Bagnaia for the lead of the race, for those big 25 points to come at the end of it. But unfortunately for Bagnaia, who had only just come back, started his recovery of his season at the last MotoGP that he won, everyone was so excited. Finally, Pecco Bagnaia back on the podium after his long string of poor performances and DNFs. And unfortunately for Bagnaia, after getting kind of just caught up in the battle, I suppose, it looked like he was kind of put off by a move from Bastianini, or he was distracted, or was just panicked and unable to control everything he needed to in the moment. Of course, it's a insanely complicated task and not one that any of us could really manage ourselves, so it's not quite fair to say that he kind of panicked and lost control of it, really. But in the context of the MotoGP race, it did look like he wasn't able to do everything he needed to do to stay in control of the bike, to stay in the fight for the lead, to keep up with the pace of Bastianini, and to just keep everything on the track. We spoke a little bit earlier about Alex Rins and Suzuki. Rins made an exceptional start. He jumped up, I think, from 7th to 4th or 3rd at the start of the race, and then as Miller and Bagnaia and Bastianini pulled away, he dropped back slightly a little bit, but was still pretty closely in that fight. But that was until after the opening laps, he had a pretty big moment where he, you know, we spoke about earlier about the difficulty of these bikes going through the runoff areas and how easy it is to lose the bikes in the runoff areas. Alex Rins has this big moment, I think like 7 or 8 laps into the race, where he's riding along, has a moment of looseness, slides through the gravel trap, but is able to kind of supercross the bike and keep it upright through the gravel trap, which is really, really impressive. The amount of skill that it takes to do that. These bikes are so powerful, and to not spin the wheels, to not dig it into the sand and leave you stuck in there, to keep it moving through the exact right speed where you're sort of skidding over the top of it without falling into it, was really, really impressive. So he keeps it up as he's going through the runoff area, and then he gets back to the track, but he's got a sort of, they're on a, it was a sort of banked corner, right, where he ended up joining back onto the track. So there's a lip at the corner of sort of the edge of the banked corner. When he's leaving the gravel trap, he's got to go sort of over this like hump, and then he'll get onto the banking of the corner and able to go continue around the track. But as he's going over this lip, he falls off effectively, loses control, slides back over across the track. Really, really scary, sketchy moment there. But stayed away from contact, no injuries, nothing serious to report, luckily. But in terms of big, scary incidents, that was really the one that we saw. But then at the end of the day, the story is that that everyone was fine. But a tricky one to watch, definitely, and a tricky one for Alex Rins when he's trying to show that he deserves to be on another factory bike, or at least to stay in the premier class of MotoGP. I'm sure there are plenty of options in World Superbike, or to move to other motorbike racing categories. But once you're in MotoGP, no one's really trying to leave MotoGP. And for Alex Rins, alongside Joan Mir, who, speaking of Joan Mir, also DNF'd this race, also had a moment and fell off. It was another kind of independent mistake there, really. It wasn't like it was something that someone else had done to him, a big block pass, or someone had pushed him out of the way there. Just really, really unfortunate that both Suzuki's, the first race back after the news that Suzuki are leaving MotoGP, kind of hanging their riders out to dry and ending their contracts and terminating them, which, of course, they retain the right to do, but it would be really, really hard as a rider to kind of keep your motivation up for the rest of the season. And, of course, the people working for the teams as well, to keep their motivation up when they know that whatever they achieve this season, it will not be rewarded by Suzuki staying in the sport. So as much as they want to kind of write their name into the history books for the last time to work for Suzuki as they complete their final season in the Premier class, I would think the incentive structure is probably a little bit tricky to get your head around. I think the biggest gap at the moment that a lot of people are kind of centering the discussion about the rider market on is Pol Espargaro's seat. So Pol Espargaro, the brother of Aleix Espargaro, who took the win for Aprilia earlier on in the season and had this huge celebration. Aleix was also on the podium in France, P3 last weekend, so a really good result for him there too. But Aleix's brother, Pol Espargaro, is Marc Marquez's teammate at the moment on the second factory Honda bike, which, you know, to ride beside Marc Marquez at the factory Honda team is a pretty daunting task for anyone. And it used to be particularly that his teammates would struggle with the fact that the bike would be very tailored to Marc Marquez's riding style, which it can be tricky sometimes to understand riding styles in MotoGP, but the way that Marquez likes to ride it, I would say that the best way I could explain it is a bit, it would be like through an analogy to Formula One, right? Where you have Max Verstappen's teammate, they come in, they join the sport, they're Max Verstappen's teammate, and suddenly they realise that the car setup, the direction of the technical development of the car is toward a driving style that is both extremely quick and also very, very difficult and very unique to Max's skill to be able to control it. To some extent, that is Max adapting to what Red Bull want, the way they found, you know, the mechanism they found to be able to get the car to drive quickly. It's hard to understand which direction exactly, you know, is Max adapting to the car, or is the car adapting to Max? But it felt like, because you could use his teammates as case studies, really, really quick drivers that had succeeded in other environments with other cars where they'd had the resources to kind of tailor the car to be what they wanted. They'd then come into Red Bull and have to work with a car that was tailored to someone else. And that's a little bit the situation that we have at Honda at the moment, where Marc Marquez has got this incredibly quick bike, but maybe not so easy for his teammates to ride. But this season, a little bit of a change of the narrative for that story that had been kind of embedded into the discussion around Marc Marquez is that, you know, it's very hard to be his teammate. We start to see that change a little bit, and we start to see Pol Espargaro get a little bit more comfortable on the bike, to be a little bit less tailored to the riding style of Marc Marquez. And I think quite rightly, because as much as Marc Marquez was the dominant champion, the incredible rider that had kind of after, well, you had Valentino Rossi, and then you had kind of Casey Stoner, Jorge Lorenzo, and then after that, your figurehead of MotoGP was Marc Marquez. He was the guy winning everything up till 2019, really. Then he had that big crash, of course, in 2020, missed the second half of the 2020 season, returned last year to have some mixed... Well, he returned at some point in 2020, but couldn't really make it work in terms of the full race distance performance, then ends up returning in 2021, putting together a pretty significant set of performances. Everyone was very impressed with how he was able to return, but it felt a little bit like the aggression switch had been turned up quite heavily because he became so much more desperate is the wrong word, but the wins weren't coming as easily, so you start having to fight harder for them. You start having to fight with the bike harder to take more risks, and we know from the punishment that Alex Rins and Joan Mir took in this race that it's not always the right thing to be riding with the red mist descending and to be riding with aggression, with anger, and with, probably a little bit of desperation where you know that you don't have a significant points tally to kind of fall back on if you get a DNF. So you need to put the risks in. You need to leave very, very little margin. And that's exactly what Marc Marquez does and is doing this season. But for Joan Mir to come in, potentially, I would go with Joan Mir over Alex Rins at the moment, despite the pretty good overtaking performances of Alex Rins. I think Joan Mir has demonstrated much more clearly that he is able to be a world champion, right? And that he's able to put together the performances needed to build a championship challenge over the distance of an entire race-long season. On a factory Honda bike, I think Joan Mir would be a proper competitor to Marc Marquez and would make him a little bit nervous. But then you, of course, have to question, well, how much role does Marc actually have in picking who he wants his teammate to be, and whether Honda will pander to him or fulfill what he wants there, or help him out and get him someone who's not so much going to challenge him. But I think Marc is a racer, and I think ultimately he will be on the side of trying to make the team as best as it can be, and having two strong riders is going to be the way to do that. Okay, I think with that we can move on from MotoGP to Formula E, which was racing in Berlin last weekend. They had round 7 and round 8 of their ABB FIA Formula E World Championship, as commentator Jack Nicholls so eloquently puts it about 10 or 12 times in the race, where he has to say the full extended name of the series that he is commentating. But Formula E, once again this season, delivered an incredible racing product in Berlin. We can look back, I think it was the 2020 championship finale, the way they were able to figure out in the coronavirus pandemic, the way they were able to finish the World Championship in 2020 was to go to this Berlin track, because it's effectively just a big, like a part of an airfield that they kind of have full usage of to put whatever barriers and paddocks up they want to in. What Formula E did in 2020 at this kind of Berlin airfield, Tempelhof airfield, they came up with a bunch of different configurations of the track. So they would do, I think it ended up being 4, right? Because they had the normal track that they'd gone to before and had designed. So the normal layout was 1. Then they would reverse the normal layout. So that's 2 tracks. Then they changed one of the corners, did it back clockwise again, and then reversed it the day after that. So they ended up with 4 different track layouts. And I think it was something crazy, like over a week they did 4 races or something, which I think was then probably what gave the inspiration for doing multiple races in the same weekend, like they did last weekend where they did back-to-back rounds. So last weekend we didn't have the change of track in between the rounds, but I did just think it was noteworthy to mention how Formula E found a path for success, found a path, as they always try and do in Formula E, to do something a little bit different, to do something a little bit weird, and incorporate it into the World Championship and to see what happens. So with round 7, the first of the 2 races in Berlin, it was a really, really cool race, just in terms of, I think, just like the quantity of overtakes. And I think the best stat that came out of it, that I've got written down in my notes here for this episode, was without any form of safety car to kind of bunch the field up and reduce those gaps in a way that is enforced by the racing rules and not just a kind of natural display of how far away the cars are from each other. Without any kind of safety car, the distance from 1st to 10th in the finishing order of the race across the line was 6.6 seconds. After over 45 minutes of racing, 0 safety cars, this is the advantage of Formula E, is that they're able to have the freedom to kind of have less to lose almost. They're able to take risks and they're able to find solutions to creating a very, very close racing series. And that's exactly what we got. I mean, imagine a Formula 1 race with no safety car where drivers finished 6.6 seconds away from 1st to 10th across the line. It's absolutely unheard of that would happen without a safety car. And that's exactly what happened in round 7 of the ABB FIA Formula E World Championship. The race was won by Edoardo Mortara. The finishing order was Mortara, from Verne, from Van Dorn, from Lotterer, from Mitch Evans. So it was a pretty tight race. Mortara started on pole, but his win wasn't really decided until with about 3 laps to go, once all the attack mode strategy had played out, him and Verne were in a fight for the lead. It looked like Mortara had enough distance in between him and Verne to kind of continue going. But I think the problem is, when you start on pole in a Formula E race, it's actually, I think there's a little bit of a connection to be made to NASCAR here. We never really see it play out so much in Formula 1 anymore because there's no refueling, or at least there's not as many risks taken with the fuel strategy. But the way that it links to NASCAR really is because when you're running at an oval in a NASCAR race, the ideal track position isn't always first because the guy in first is using up all the air, if you can think about it like that. The clean air that he's driving into, while it's good for his aerodynamics, it's not a slipstream, right? So it's not something that is going to be allowing him to use less fuel than the cars around him. Actually, it's going to be making him use more fuel to punch the hole in the air for the other people. The people behind him will then able to use less fuel. And of course, Formula E, it's not petrol, it's not fuel, it's energy consumption. But like NASCAR, like Formula 1 as well, there's a limit on how much energy you can use over a race distance. And of course, every single car on the grid has that exact same limit. They all try and push it and finish the race with 0.001% left or whatever, because that's how, that's the skill of it, is using up every single drop of the energy, don't leave any on the table, but also don't run out. That's the skill and the balancing act and the strategy element of it. But in Formula E, because it is still going to use more energy to punch the hole in the air for everyone else when you're out front leading the race, for Edo Mortara, when he's starting from pole, while it is an advantage in terms of track position, it's so manic in Formula E going down into turn one that starting in first, at least it means you're not going to rear end anyone. The only option is that someone's going to go into the back of you with a big dive bomb, which we nearly saw in the second Berlin round 8 of the ABB FIA Formula E World Championship. But we'll get onto that later. But for Mortara, with that kind of burden of being out first and having higher energy consumption, it allowed Verne to close up quite significantly in the last few laps after all the attack mode strategy had played out. It looked like while Mortara had done a very, very good job at staying in the fight with that increased energy consumption in first, he was slowing down a little bit and Verne was closing up in on him. But what ended up happening, and I would really highly recommend go and check out this clip, you'll find it, I guess, on the Formula E or the Channel 4 YouTube channel. It was sort of a over-exuberant defensive move from Mortara, who was effectively mimicking a statement that Martin Brundle says quite a lot in the Formula 1 commentary. It's a criticism that he often wedges against Formula 1 drivers when he accuses them of defending against clean air. So when there's someone behind them, but that person behind them isn't actually making a move to dive bomb up the inside at a certain corner, but the car in front still moves over and defends as if the car behind them was going to make that move. And that's basically what Mortara did. So he shoots over to the inside even though Verne isn't making a big dive bomb on him. Verne then kind of takes advantage, does actually go and make the dive bomb because Mortara's kind of entices Verne into making this big dive bomb. Verne sends it up the inside. But I think because he was a little bit put off by what is Mortara doing here? It looks like he's defending against thin air. Verne makes this big dive bomb through. Then Mortara takes this really beautiful late apex, squares off the corner. It's kind of a switchback, really, which is what it's called when someone makes a dive bomb on you and you go straight back underneath them because they've gone long on the brakes. Really, that's what happened. It was kind of a weird moment to watch where it felt like, well, Mortara was already leading, so he's kind of done this to just send Verne off on his own and distract him. At the end of the day, it did cause Verne to lose time because Verne has made this dive bomb, picked a completely different, braking marker, gone way too late into the corner, then afterwards let the door open for Mortara to go back through. And the fact that Verne was dropped back at that corner created the distance then for Mortara to go on and end up winning the race. So whether it was on purpose or not, it did work and Mortara got the win there. The first win of him for this ABB FIA Formula E World Championship season. And yeah, it was a really cool race all round. I think the stat that stood out to me from round 7 was that incredible distance between first and 10th. And part of that is the energy strategy, where because everyone has the same energy strategy, the cars are probably more similar than different, even though there are different powertrains. They are somewhat spec'd out to be relatively similar throughout the field and relatively, not going to see a big performance gap between the top and the bottom teams. And I think, yeah, we saw a perfect manifestation of that in round 7. So we'll move on to round 8 now. The winner of round 8 in Berlin in Formula E was Nick de Vries, who made an absolutely incredible move. Again, alongside the Mortara clip, I would really recommend to go and check this one out if you want to see an exciting, daring overtake into turn 1 that ended up winning de Vries the race. He gets this incredible start from P3 on the grid, absolutely sends it up the inside of Mortara and Robin Freins, and just sticks in it. Just, was, I think, a little bit under a car width was left for him at the apex, but ended up being able to squeeze his way through. A little bit of contact, as we like to see in Formula E. There's a little bit more bodywork to throw around, and de Vries made pretty perfect use of that with this massive send up the inside to take P1. And the difference between round 7 and round 8 in Berlin, they didn't go for the change of track or the reverse track like they did at the end of 2020, but what they did do was change the attack mode. So traditionally, races like Monaco and other Formula E races this season, you get 2 4-minute periods, which you get then, we've gone over this before, like by going over that kind of Mario Kart speed boost pad on the track, you get this 4-minute power boost and you have to use it twice, which is why it becomes a strategic element, because you're trying to use it at a different time to the people around you to get the edge on them. But the big switch for round 8 was that instead of going from 2 4-minute periods where you have to go over it twice, it was changed to 1 8-minute period. And whether that was really just because they were looking for something easy that they could change in between the rules, or whether the teams complained about it being too boring and, you didn't want to just see the same race play out twice, it's hard to say to what extent it really affected the racing. I think the only real impact that we saw from that was so Nick de Vries ended up winning the race. The finishing order was de Vries from Mortara, from Van Dorn, from de Grassi, from Freins. Mortara, significantly, he was the only one that really kind of took a risk with the energy strategy in this one. The plan was wait until everyone else has used it, save as much energy as you can, because you do use more energy when you're in attack mode, so that is part of as well of the energy strategy. But Mortara basically just left it right until the end of the race. Expected, I think, that most people were going to get a bit greedy and overconsume and then have to energy save at the end of the race. Mortara, with so many people doing the same thing in motorsport, we see this across categories. If everyone's doing the same strategy, A, it will be because they're all copying each other and no one wants to be the one that takes the risk, or B, it will be because that's just the fastest strategy. And it can be quite hard to figure out which one's which, right? But for Mortara, I think he was in the position where he'd won the race before, the day before, and you knew that he was still going to be on pole for this one, but it was just a really bold call from his strategy team to be like, look, we're going to go opposite, right? We're going to go opposite to all the people around us. He ended up, dropping back to 5th at one point from being 2nd after lap 1. Everyone else takes their attack mode, gets past him while he's a few seconds back, energy saving. To some extent, the other teams know that he's doing this, but their own calculations must have worked out that, it wasn't the path for their team and their car to do that. But Mortara drops down to 5th, takes his attack mode at the end, and gets back up to 2nd and really, really makes it work. I think without de Vries' margin that he gained on his own, Mortara could have been within the fight for lead. He was chasing down de Vries at the end, but couldn't quite make it work. But overall, Mortara comes out of this weekend with the most points of any single driver on the grid, which is a really, really significant result for him and his championship and the Rocket Venturi Racing team. Him in that team there, alongside the Mercedes team, both powered by the Mercedes Formula E powertrains, which are, at least in Berlin, but it also looks like in the context of the wider technical development of the season, the strongest ones. While Mercedes may be struggling quite heavily on the technical side in Formula 1 at the moment, I'm not sure how much solace it will give them, but they are at the top of the development pile in Formula E, and so are their customer teams as well, which is what we've really seen in Formula 1, is not only Mercedes, but their customer teams have dropped back to the customer budgets are much, much higher in Formula 1, so I'm not sure the Mercedes team will be too over the moon, but it's better than nothing, right? One last thing that I also wanted to mention in the Formula E Berlin races, actually not in the races, but in the qualifying session for the first of the two, so the qualifying session on Saturday morning, we saw something that had only been seen one time before in the history of Formula 1, which was 2 drivers getting the exact same time in qualifying. And we can look back now, so if you remember our podcast with Jack Nichols, we spoke about the new dual qualifying format, in Formula E where it's one lap qualifying and the drivers will just go out kind of one behind the other, 1v1 in a knockout style, and whoever gets the fastest lap out of the two progresses on to the next round, and so on until you get to the final. That's really how they do the qualifying at the moment in Formula E. But the problem is, in Formula 1, having a timed session where 3 drivers all get the exact same time, which happened before at the 1997 European Grand Prix, where Jacques Villeneuve, Michael Schumacher and Heinz-Harald Frentzen all got the exact same qualifying time down to the thousandths of a second. It was really, really cool. I think really it was Murray Walker's reaction that makes that clip, but of course also the drama that happened at the race the following day at the 1997 European Grand Prix. If you don't remember it, well, of course I don't remember either, because I wasn't alive, but I remember reading it on the internet and watching the clip of it in a documentary, and it was the race where Villeneuve went on to become world champion, and Michael Schumacher ended up getting eliminated from world championship contention because he tried to punt Villeneuve off in a kind of self-described moment of rage and madness. After the race, he didn't really want to admit that it was on purpose, but it's pretty clear when you watch the onboard that he sees Villeneuve go down the inside of him and then turns the wheel over and effectively drives straight into him. And it may have been a little bit of an overreaction from the FIA to not just, disqualify him from the race, but to ban him from the entire World Championship. I think it was primarily because he wouldn't admit to the mistake that he was eliminated from contention for 1997. And of course, we know what Michael Schumacher went on to become at Ferrari, but those were the sort of darker days. 1997 at Ferrari for Michael Schumacher wasn't the best time. And speaking of time, it was that in qualifying that gave him the exact same time as the 2 other drivers. But the rule that came into play there, because it's a kind of a group qualifying session in Formula 1, the rule that gave Villeneuve the position in qualifying over Schumacher and Frentzen was because it was the driver who would set the time first. When the times are equal, it's the driver who sets the time first who gets to keep the higher position of the 3, which makes enough sense. I think, you've got to come up with something to be the delineating factor when you've got 3 people with the exact same result. They can't all 3 start next to each other on the grid, so you need something to pull them apart. And I think the idea that whoever does it first deserves to be the front of the 3 is completely fair enough. Until you get to Formula E, where you're in a dual qualifying format, where by the definition of the rules in that format, you have to go out one after the other. And when Jean-Eric Vergne and Alexander Sims are in a qualifying duel, Alexander Sims goes out first, sets the time, and then Jean-Eric Vergne goes out second, sets the exact same time. But the letter of the rules say the driver that goes out first, the driver that sets the time first, gets to keep the position and go through. But when it's a dual format and it's knockout and the other driver then is just stuck with that grid position of losing a semi-final and not being able to progress and fight for pole, I don't know, it felt a little bit strange when it's a definition of the rules that they have to go out one after the other. It's not like Vergne could have done anything differently to be the one that goes out first out of the 2, apart from, I guess... No, because I think it's like seeded, so I don't even think it, of course he won the round before that, so I don't think it mattered how he performed in the round before that made him end up going second out of the 2. I think it was that's just how they were picked, right? So that rule, that it's whoever sets the time first of the 2, was enforced, and they gave Sims the progression. He ended up going out to the final and then coming second, starting second on the grid. Vergne ended up having a higher finishing position than Sims, so I guess you can argue that karmic justice was played out there. But still, a bit of a weird one, and for my fellow Formula racing nerds, I think that little bit of technical weirdness was an interesting watch, if a little bit frustrating, because it didn't really make sense. But they will probably change that rule coming up, and I'm sure they're working on it at the moment. But I think that's enough Formula E, so let's move on to the IndyCar race. And what a race it was at the Indianapolis road course. We're in the run-up now to the Indy 500, and before the Indy 500, what we always get is the race on the Indianapolis road circuit, which is the race that Formula 1 actually used to race at up until 2007. Lewis Hamilton, of course, raced there in his debut season, put in a really cool performance. 2007 US Grand Prix was a really, really cool one, but that was the last time Formula 1 ever went there. But the IndyCars were out racing on that circuit last weekend, and personally for me, I think I have to say that it was the best IndyCar race I've ever seen. Of course, with the amazing commentary from Sky reporter Tom Gaymore, made it pretty excellent. Personally, I don't know if anyone else watched that race, watched it live. But there was a moment for me where Tom read out one of my tweets on the broadcast and answered one of the questions I sent in, which was a very cool moment for me watching at home. Besides that, the racing on track was absolutely incredible. So, yeah, it was at the Indianapolis Grand Prix circuit, but really what made it a fascinating race, the real key factor, was the weather. Everyone loves when we get a wet Formula One race or we get an intermediate Formula One race where you have slick tyres, intermediate tyres, crossover point, you're not sure which one to go on, you're driving on slicks in the wet, it's a real test of the racing driver, blah, 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 blah. Everyone always loves those races, but for IndyCar, it was almost even crazier than when it happens in Formula One because the strategies were so weird and messed up, and because you have refueling, because you have so many cautions, it just was so mixed up. There were so many cautions, safety car restarts, moments for everyone throughout the race. And to try and describe all of it on this podcast, I'll be running out of time very quickly. But I can tell you the finishing order was Colton Herta from Simon Pagenaud from Willpower, from Marcus Ericsson from Connor Daly. Those are your top 5. There was also Callum Ilott finishing in the points in P8 for him. Probably best result he's got since joining IndyCar. To finish that race at all was a pretty big achievement, but to finish in the points for Callum Ilott, who is distinctly not in a very good car this year, it's those wet races where it should come together for him and where the field is kind of leveled a little bit by the mania of the conditions and the uncertainty of what the weather will do next. The luck that goes into that is massive, but for Ilott, I would say it was definitely the best performance we've seen out of him since he joined IndyCar at the start of this year. All I can say really is please go check out the highlights, because the battle between Colton Herta and Pato O'Ward, Herta had this incredible moment where he'd just come out of the pits. I think he was racing O'Ward, trying to get up to O'Ward's gearbox, and it was going around a kind of tight corner, intermediate conditions, and he gets this massive end swapper on, back's coming round on him, and it's an IndyCar, so you don't have power steering, so that the weight of that steering wheel, the feel you get through it, it's really good because you get that sensation of feeling the tyres probably more than you do in a Formula One car. But the strength that you need to operate it, the strength in the wrists to resist the forces going through the wheel, to put in your own movement to it, to not just be yanked around by the force feedback, and to be able to control it against the force of a big end swapping slide was absolutely mega. And I think if you go watch the clip of him doing this, Tokyo Drift is how the IndyCar promoters and marketers are all labeling it. But it was really, really incredible. A brilliant bit of car control. And he was in second at the time. And after that slide, he went on in the next few corners, basically, to go and make the move for the lead that ended up being the one that decided the race. It was a really, really fascinating battle. There was that slide save that was a huge moment. I think also the fuel and tyre management played quite a big role. The strategies were so weird, but really it was just getting onto slicks at the right time and then managing those slick tyres the way they needed to be managed. Using the pace at the right time is very, very difficult, of course, when you don't know what the weather's going to do. You don't know how long you need to save them for. And then, if a caution comes out, you just go in and get a new set, right? So you don't really know how well you need to manage them. But in a race like that, for Colton Herta, a hugely significant player in that is going to be his dad. And the reason for that is Colton Herta's dad, Brian Herta, ex-driver himself, is Colton Herta's race engineer. So in a race as manic as that, when you're probably making 4 or 5 pit stops, you've got all the people around you doing different things, you've got slides to save, you've got to make dive bombs for the lead, you're taking an incredible victory for the Andretti team, and your dad is in your ear the whole time telling you what's going down, keeping your mind right, keeping it straight. We know Herta's had problems before pushing too hard when he's not leading and, not being able to show that he's calm and collected and a little bit maybe Verstappen-esque in that way. Not being the perfect calm soldier that he needs to be all the time, because that is not really possible to manage your kind of mentality that well. No one's perfect, and you're going to get angry, you're going to get annoyed, you're going to take it out on the car and the other drivers and the tyres really at times. But it was this race where I think we saw that connection between Colton and Brian Herta, the father-son connection, was epic, and the celebrations at the end were really, really cool. Also competing in this race was Juan Pablo Montoya, winner of the Indy 500 before, but he's getting prepared for an Indy 500 run this year, and he was competing in the Grand Prix track at the Indianapolis road course last weekend. And I would say it was about as close as you can get to a baptism of fire to get back into an IndyCar race that's that crazy, that manic, that mixed up conditions. On the track, you're going to be, flying around 210 miles an hour around the oval next weekend. People that watched the Miami Grand Prix might remember Juan Pablo Montoya. Of course, people that watched Formula One back at the early 2000s will remember his wins there with Williams and McLaren, but people that watched the Miami Grand Prix will remember Juan Pablo Montoya from being a part of the Sky commentary team, being the ex-driver commentator, giving his opinion on Formula One as a part of the commentary there. It was really interesting to see, he was involved very heavily with the promotion of the Miami race, and no one can deny how much they succeeded in promoting that race. But after he was finished with that job, it was straight back in the car for the Indy 500 prep, and that's exactly what he did. He was in the fight right up until the end. He was in the points. He was, I think, P6 right up until the end, took advantage, everyone else crashing out. I think Romain Grosjean had a spin towards the end. He was one of the ones that tried to make it work on the slick tyres throughout the wet conditions, tried to stay out, not do the pit stops and gain the track position that way. But as soon as they went back to green flags, Grosjean lost it all. But Montoya was in the right tyres, in the right position, intermediates. I think, P6 going over through the last kind of 5 laps. Everyone was like, oh my God, Montoya is going to be in the 500 next weekend, and he's just put in this incredible performance. It demonstrates he's comfortable with the team, he's confident with the car, he's going to be really, really happy with this result. And into the wall he goes, and that's game over for Montoya. That was, really, really tragic. It was actually the yellow flag caused by that crash ended the race, unfortunately. I think Montoya will still take a good amount of positives to be in the position where you don't bring it home, but you have so much going for you, so much, so many good things that happen throughout the race put you in that position where ultimately to go and lose it all against the barrier is really, really tough. But if you have nothing to lose, that's almost worse, right? And I think when you're talking preparations for the 500, it was about as difficult as you could get, I'm sure, mentally as a racing driver to contain all of that. While it is still a road race, the intensity of the 500 is probably comparable to the intensity that we saw last weekend at the Grand Prix circuit. But definitely go check out that race. I think that's really all I needed to mention there with regards to the IndyCar race. I can't really do it justice on the podcast. All I can say is please go check it out. And go send Tom a message too. If you watched it live and enjoyed his commentary, get in touch, because he will, go through, read out tweets throughout the broadcast, and to see that side of the fan engagement was also really, really cool. So check out next weekend. Tom's going to be on Sky hosting their coverage of the 500, and he's going to come back on the show after the race to do a little recap and review with me as well, which is going to be really, really cool to hear. Check out the race and look forward to the podcast after that with Tom. One last thing that I wanted to touch on before we get to the preview of the upcoming Spanish Formula One Grand Prix this weekend was the NASCAR action that we had last weekend. So people that watched the Miami race, we touched on Juan Pablo Montoya's commentary at it. One person that was also at the Miami race, who is a huge motorsport fan and a star that is closer to my family, my heart than maybe a few others, would be Michael Jordan, the basketball player. Michael Jordan was at the race. He was out there, seeing Lewis, blending in with all the sports stars around the world. But one thing we did see at Miami was a lot of people in the comments saying, well, all these celebrities, they're just there to be celebrities. They don't really care about racing. And that is an accusation that you absolutely cannot level at Michael Jordan. He bloody loves a bit of racing, and he actually owns a NASCAR team. And the NASCAR team that he owns is called 2311 Racing. They won their first race of the season last weekend at Kansas at the Advent Health 400. The two drivers for the 2311 team are Kurt Busch, brother of Kyle Busch, and then Bubba Wallace, who is one of the more kind of publicly well-known figures in NASCAR. But it was Kurt Busch who went on to take the win in Kansas. And for the first win of 2311's 2022 season, it was really, really cool. So he led for 116 laps out of an overall 267, which means he also got, I think, a stage win in that, which is really, really valuable points there. Your top 5 finishing order was Kurt Busch, from Kyle Larson, from Kyle Busch, from Denny Hamlin, who actually, Denny Hamlin, the driver, funnily enough, he co-owns 2311 Racing with Michael Jordan. So Denny Hamlin, driving for another team in NASCAR, owns the 2311 team with Michael Jordan, which is a little bit strange. It would be very hard to imagine that in Formula One. People would be very, very quick to complain about the conflict of interest there. But I think it's just because Denny Hamlin is genuinely just a good guy. I think he's very aware of the conflict of interest there. and is, actively working against that narrative that he's, kind of creating these little insider conspiracies as a driver. But Hamlin and Jordan together do own the team that ended up winning the race. So I'm sure a little bit of a weird feeling for Denny Hamlin to be frustrated at a P4, but when the team that you actually co-own, and I'm sure, in terms of the bottom line money-wise, he was pretty happy with the result of that race. And I'm sure to keep the big boss MJ happy was pretty cool too. So just to reiterate, your top 5 was Kurt Busch from Kyle Larson, from Kyle Busch, from Denny Hamlin, from Christopher Bell. Rounded out your top 5 there. Really, really close championship we've got in NASCAR this season. I would really recommend people go check out the NASCAR. It's more racing action, and it's high quality racing action, and it's a type of racing action that is really, really different. And actually, one last thing I wanted to touch on with regards to NASCAR, the scale of the numbers when we look at, the Miami Grand Prix, right? Estimated about 2.6 million viewers on American telly. Of course, plus, all the people there in person, and I suppose all the people streaming it illegally that don't get counted into the numbers. But if you're going off TV viewer figures, about 2.6 million in America, which is as big as it's ever been, allegedly. But relative to the Daytona 500, the 2022 Daytona 500, which is the NASCAR Super Bowl, their kind of flagship event, like probably Monaco for Formula One, the Monaco that is absolutely nothing like the Monaco Grand Prix. But the Monaco equivalent for NASCAR is this Daytona 500. And in terms of TV viewers, the Daytona 500 in NASCAR, which allegedly is this kind of dying sport that no one cares about, got like 4 times the viewers of the Miami Grand Prix. And then I think, an average NASCAR race, maybe not the Kansas one that happened last weekend, because I think that was a kind of particularly mid-tier one where it's not going to attract high amounts of viewers. But the one next weekend, that is the Charlotte race, that is still going to attract a high amount of viewers, and that is still going to be one that will beat Formula One in its viewing statistics. So as much as it can be hard to kind of think that NASCAR and Formula One are actually on a scale where NASCAR is winning still at the moment, even though people complain about NASCAR dying and they've got empty fans and it's boring, whatever, it's competing with Formula One still with a much less international following, of course. But I think it's notable, right? I think those statistics are quite important to remember to put into context the growth of F1 in America and how much there is left to go regarding the growth of F1 in America. And speaking of Formula One, lastly for this episode, we are going to dive into a deep preview of the upcoming Spanish Grand Prix, because I'm really, really looking forward to, it's Formula One race week again. Everyone's very excited. Even though it is Spain, I think people are still quite excited. And we spoke quite a lot last week about Spain with the Paddock Princesses girls. Thanks again to those guys for coming on the show and making it a really, really interesting podcast last week. But I think building off of some of the stuff that we said in that podcast, I wanted to dive in a little bit more detail to the upcoming Spanish Grand Prix. So I think, I think it's going to be a really interesting race regarding the pressure that's going to be on Carlos Sainz, whether he's going to be able to meet that, to take his first ever win would be pretty cool. And I was doing a little bit of research into like the history of Spanish winners at the Spanish Grand Prix. Fernando Alonso in 2013 is the only recorded Spanish national to win at the Spanish Grand Prix. But you also had Pastor Maldonado, who is from Colombia, Spanish-speaking country, in 2012 won the race, and as well Juan Manuel Fangio in 1956, I believe, 51, sorry, won the race. He's from Argentina, another Spanish-speaking winner of the Spanish Grand Prix. So, there's a little bit more history there than just Fernando Alonso. And also, according to the Wikipedia page, if you go as much research as I've done for this show, it means to going on Wikipedia and seeing what I can see. In 1913, Carlos Salamanca won a kind of informal race, was set up by the kind of Spanish Automobile Association that went on to become the Spanish governing body of race cars. But, 1913, you didn't really have proper cars in that sort of that era. Of course, you didn't really have formal racing. You didn't have Formula One until 1950 after the Second World War. So you can't really call it the Spanish Grand Prix per se. But technically there was a race organised called at the time a Grand Prix equivalent of a Spanish Grand Prix, racing the best cars they had in Spain at that time. And that race was won by a Spanish winner. Regarding other headlines coming up for the Spanish Grand Prix, I think a lot of it is going to be focused around the upgrade packages. Allegedly, Aston Martin are trying to bring quite a big one. A lot of pressure on them, of course, to develop their car underperforming hugely relative to budget and also relative to prior seasons. I mean, they were, where were they, like third in the constructors table or something in 2020 when they had the pink Mercedes. But yeah, to be this season, to have Sebastian Vettel on your team and to not be providing him with a car that's able to finish in the points more often than not is pretty poor. So they need to up their game and they need to bring a significant upgrade package to Spain. And with the amount of testing that people have done before at Spain, the knowledge people have of the Spain track, I would expect some pretty well-developed cars, some pretty quick cars to be there this weekend, and hopefully a little bit of a shift up in the running order. But what else have we got in terms of headlines? I think Fernando Alonso, Carlos Sainz, we spoke about that last week. The track design, we have that new hairpin. Used to be a hairpin, now they've widened it to increase the quality of the bike racing. If you need any proof that the Catalonia track is pretty exceptional for bike racing, go back and check out the 2008 MotoGP at Barcelona. It was a fascinating battle between Lorenzo and Rossi. But in terms of Formula One, it's struggled a lot before in the past in terms of the quality of the racing, the quality of the overtaking. And with the 2022 cars, I think people are really, really interested. It's going to be a massive test regarding the overheating of the front tyres and the influence of the dirty air. Really, really big test for these regulations, these drivers, and these cars with the upcoming Spanish Grand Prix. But in terms of other headlines, both Formula 2 and Formula 3 will be back at the Catalonia track, so it'll be really cool to see those seasons getting back underway and to see how those drivers have developed in their gaps off from the sport. We also have, in the FP1 Formula 1 session, Juri Vips and Nick de Vries, both Formula 1 rookies, are going to be taking part. Juri Vips will be in the Red Bull car, in Sergio Perez's car, which is a really, really cool step for him. To see a rookie get given a chance in one of those top cars, beyond just one of the cars at the back of the grid that can really use the development time for Red Bull to put the trust in Juri Vips. I'm not sure whether he's just, paid them a big bunch of money and they've decided that it's the right thing for them, to keep the money and get their driver academy funded properly. Maybe Juri Vips has got the test that way, but I think to some extent it has to be a balancing act between them really wanting to show their investment in him and his skill. We know how good Red Bull are at pushing their young drivers through, but also some of the problems that are occurring when they do that. When we see drivers go through too quickly, it is possible for that to kind of negatively impact their growth over their career, or at least halt it a little bit, or mean that they actually can't perform their best with Red Bull and that they have to go to another team, step away from that academy program before they can fully flourish. And we've seen that actually a little bit with Alex Albon. And speaking of Williams, it will be the Williams car that Nick de Vries will be testing in. Nick de Vries, Formula E world champion last season. He's really also going to be looking to show his pace on a Formula 1 grid and demonstrate his value to the paddock as drivers are kind of looking to move around. We're getting into contract season and there's going to be questions asked every year about whether the best drivers are in Formula 1 at the moment. And when you've got the opportunity to show up in a practice session, it's time to show that you're worthy of one of those seats full time. In Formula 2 at the moment, the championship top 5 is Teo Pourchaire, Felipe Drogovic, Jehan Daruvula, Liam Lawson and Richard Verschoor. So those are going to be the ones to look out for to see where they are in the points runnings, and their finishing positions is obviously going to have a big impact on the outcome of that championship. It's only the 4th round of the Formula 2 championship this year and plenty of season left to happen, but I think Spain's going to be a big one where, as we see in the Formula 1 cars, they can be quite happy to kind of sit behind someone and try to not use up the front tyres and, burn them out too quickly. But in Formula 2, because there are so many DNFs, so much chaos, so much more uncertainty, the points are a bit more hard to come by and the overtakes have to be a little bit more aggressive. And when you apply that to a track like Spain where overtaking is going to be more difficult, that doesn't ever tend to really stop the Formula 2 drivers. They love to overtake at Monaco. They'll go for it anywhere. They'll send a dive bomb in any corner they like. And that extends even further, I think, to Formula 3 when the cars are so much more nimble, agile, and a little bit slower through the corners, but still under control. There's more time for the drivers to think, right? And when the driving standard overall is a little bit lower, more kind of average level of mistakes throughout the grid, that means there's going to be more opportunities to pass people, even on a track where overtaking isn't the easiest. So keep an eye out for Formula 2 and Formula 3. In Formula 3, your championship runners at the moment are Victor Martins from Arthur Leclerc, from Roman Stanak, from Jack Crawford, and Isaac Hadjar is in P5, so it's a pretty tight championship there. Actually, Victor Martins and Arthur Leclerc have the exact same amount of points, but I think because Martin has more wins, I suppose, than Leclerc, he gets to take the lead in that championship at the given moment. But with so much of the season left to play out, I think it's really going to be the battle between Martins and Leclerc that's going to play out over the season's distance. I think we spoke about with Formula 2 the level of chaos. even higher in Formula 3, and I think it parallels Moto3 a little bit. We spoke about at the start of the podcast the kind of chaos that we see in junior bike racing, and that extends to Formula 3 in the Grand Prix kind of junior series progression. When you get more mistakes, you get more drivers willing to take risks and send it up the inside, because they know ultimately if you don't finish first or second or maybe third in the Formula 3 championship this year, your chances at progression, if you're not coming with a huge budget, you're only really going to get recruited into a driver academy that's going to pay your bills for you if you can demonstrate truly exceptional performances. And what tends to get the eye of anyone when you're looking for a truly exceptional performance is those incredible overtakes. It's what we remember from Lewis Hamilton's GP2 career and the way he was able to carve up the grid to get the eyes of the Formula 1 teams and understand that this was a serious talent. Obviously, with Lewis specifically, it had been something that had been said about him since he was racing RC cars as a little kid. Everyone had their eyes on this guy as being a potential future star in racing. But in Formula 3, obviously, it's a little more kind of organised and unified at the moment than it was in the old days of Lewis's career. The progression is meant to be a little bit more linear. I suppose Oscar Piastri would ask some questions about that when he won back-to-back Formula 3 and Formula 2 championships and was not immediately rewarded with a Formula 1 seat, but he was rewarded with a contract that is almost definitely going to end up in a Formula 1 seat at some point, which I think is just about good enough, but I'm sure it is tricky for him to have to take that year out. One last thing that I wanted to mention this week was the return of the WRC Portugal, one of the best rallies that happens throughout the WRC calendar, one of the ones that catches all the eyes with the really draw-dropping stage design and really exciting soft gravel roads is WRC Portugal, and especially after the Oit Tanak Calais Rovanpera battle at the last rally in the championship, all eyes are going to be on the Portugal rally to see whether Rovanpera can continue his championship charge as he leads the WRC standings at the moment. He's really putting the pressure on the rest of the grid and showing how good he is, and when he keeps taking Superstage win points, overall rally win points, it's going to be really, really hard to catch him unless someone can come in and displace him or make him nervous. But of course, with rallying, it's all about keeping the car on the road for the distance of the entire rally. In Portugal, we've got 338 kilometers of stages over 3 days, so it's going to be a really, really intense one for these guys. And also for Rovanpera, in between Croatia, where he won there in that incredible battle against Tanak, he's been out drifting at Mondello Park in Ireland with the Red Bull Drift Masters European Championship, I think it's called, or something along the lines of that. But he was out there competing, and I think he made it into the kind of final 16. He was relatively competitive for his debut, and with the culture that they have in rallying and well, I think it's in Ireland quite significantly. They've got some few real talents out there, and also just overall in Europe, the kind of more club level, low budget, at least compared to, WRC Formula 1, that sort of thing. The rallying championships are still incredibly exciting and demonstrate that they can provide really, really cool action. I would definitely recommend, if anyone's got time to do a YouTube deep dive, going through some of the Japanese rally commentary videos and understanding the dynamics of the drifting sport, where they're doing those sort of tandem judged performative kind of style driving and mixing in like how they judge those style points versus how they judge it through speed, through crowd anticipation, through overall drama of it, and to kind of integrate a type of motorsport that obviously isn't directly to do with lap time. I think it's really interesting to see someone like Rovanpera go and take that challenge out. Obviously with the rally driver, it's no strange moment for them to be sliding around all four wheels, drifting around the track, but to be doing it with another car next to them is going to be a pretty significant change from what they're used to. And also just the physics and the engineering of these drift cars, the way the differential works, the slide angles they can get on these cars are truly, truly incredible. I'm sure a big learning curve for Rovanpera, but I'm sure he enjoyed the heck out of it, and now he's back at WRC Portugal to try and stay at the top of the standings. So with that, I think that's everything from me this week. It's been a pretty action-packed episode. We've covered all different kinds of categories this week, and there's plenty of action happening around the motorsport world every weekend. Now we're getting up and running with the summer swing of the European Formula 1 season and the Indy 500 weekend after next. Plenty of stuff going on, and it's really, really great to be able to cover it all on the show. We've also got some really cool interviews coming up. YouTuber Josh Revel is going to be on the show next week. He's a Kiwi YouTuber. He's got over 300,000 subscribers. Really big fan of his content for a long time. And it's going to be really cool to interview him, to hear more about the YouTube side of producing content, what it's like adapting to that market, and how he kind of found this place in the industry there as a content creator, making his own videos, and now he's working with Formula 2 officially, so he's really found some success there and risen to the top of the creator pile. People have really enjoyed his content, and he's growing week by week massively. It's going to be really great to interview him and to hear more about it. And also, after the Indy 500, friend of the show Tom Gaymore is going to be coming back on to give us a review. I would really recommend checking out the 500 this year. With the way IndyCar's gone so far this season, the kind of present context of that championship, I've described it as best as I can at the moment in this podcast, but definitely check out the Indy 500 and look forward to Tom's commentary. We spoke with Tom in our episode about the way they covered the 500 last year and the fact that Sky were willing to put more and more investment into their IndyCar coverage, more and more investment into Tom really as a host there. It's really cool to see how much they trust him to kind of control that content and how much money they're willing to put behind it. And having drivers like Lando Norris come on the broadcast and, give their take on IndyCar and show how important it is to the motorsport world for fans of maybe just Formula One to really understand the international open wheel market beyond just the premier class of motorsport. It's really cool to see how the different categories fit together and how different races are won, right? Different strategies you see in different sports. Formula One, while it is so massive, it doesn't have everything, right? And there are lessons to be learned from other categories. And when you look at the Indy 500, it's the flagship event of one of the coolest racing series in the world, in my opinion. To see that play out this year, and I think also, to see the Sky coverage of it, to see what they come up with, how they present it this year, how they adapt it to last year, and then also to hear from Tom after he's been on telly, doing his hardest day of the year, busy week for him, I'm sure. But to hear all about that race afterwards from his perspective, what it was like in the commentary booth, and also to get the breakdown, all the ins and outs of what happened on track, going to be really cool. So two great interviews coming up and plenty more throughout the summer. So for this week, that's it from me. Really cool episode this week, as I've already said. So hope you enjoyed. Leave a like, a comment, and feel free to get in touch with any guests or questions or topics you'd like to see brought up on the show. But I can let the outro song play, and I'll be back next week for another episode of the Jack Threlfall Show.